This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Company. Hey everybody, welcome to it today. I am your host, Spencer Durant, and this is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone. And this is, of course, from the wonderful folks, all of us here at Ventures Fly Company. I say wonderful folks, including myself. That comes off a little bit arrogant. Everybody else here is wonderful. I'll leave it up to you to decide if I also count as wonderful. All right. Kidding aside, hope you guys are doing great. It is another chilly evening here in Wyoming as I record in my drafty, hopefully soon to be remodeled home. So that's the only downside when you move to Wyoming, if you ever do, which I would discourage anybody from. It's way too many people here. The traffic's horrible. You got to share. There aren't bike lanes in Wyoming. There are sheep lanes. So, go figure. No, I would hope that we get to remodel this place soon because this house is old and it is drafty. And I don't know if y'all know this, but come wintertime, it gets a little bit chilly here in Wyoming. So anyways, enough about that. Let's get to what y'all are here for. Okay. Not a discourse on home buying tips, which, disclaimer, I'm not a home buying expert, so I can give them to you, but I do know how to fly fish a little bit, so we can get into the fly fishing side of the show. All right. Now, I think we've got a great show lined up tonight. And I'm not just saying that because I'm the one who did the lining up. Some of the questions that we got for this week, really good questions. And again, if you ever want to get your question answered on the show, I will put a link to where you can submit those questions on the website and you can hear your question answered on the air. All right. And get a little bit of gravitas there with that. You can put that's a resume item. Yeah. Once had a question answered on Untangled Fly Fishing for everyone. That's a bullet point I would, really respect if I was ever in a hiring position. Hopefully they never put me in that. So, all right. Seriously, kidding aside, let's get down to business today. All right, folks. So our first question is from Ken in New York. Ken in New York. Thank you. His question: how long do you stay at a run or pool before moving on to new water? All right, this is a really great question, Ken. Now, in reality, it depends. Like everything else in fly fishing, it depends. All right. I know y'all are probably sick of hearing that answer, but it's true. It just kind of depends on what's going on. All right. That's just the nature of fly fishing. That's just how this beast rolls. Okay. There is no tried and true, like, here is the one thing to always do in this situation answer. I wish there was. There's just not. Okay. Now, I did spend some time looking through different resources on this topic again. And what I found is that there's really not a consensus in the fly fishing world about like a set time that you should spend fishing one spot before you move on to a new spot. All right. Instead, it's highly recommended that you focus on thoroughly covering water that you're fishing. Okay. So before you move on, before you go to the next hole, cover the water that you're fishing. All right. If you don't cover the water well enough, you run the risk of spooking fish from their lives as you wade upstream. Now, I'm going to illustrate that. I was in the Uinta Mountains in Utah. I grew up in Utah and I've been expatriated to Wyoming since then. I grew up in Utah, love it down there. The fishing is fantastic. And everybody who thinks about going fishing in Wyoming, don't go to Utah. All right. Just drive on through old Wyo and go right to Utah. Okay. Just don't pass go. Don't collect $200. Definitely do not stop by the Miracle Mile or the Green River or the Wind River Mountains or the Wyoming Range or Yellowstone. Just drive right on by that Wasatch Front down there in Utah. Park yourself on the lower Provo River and have a great time. Anyways, I was on this little stream up in the Uintas, not a very big stream, and most of the fish in there, we're talking are like 8-9 inch brook trout. Okay? A 10-inch fish, like you catch 10, 11, 12-inch fish, that is a fantastic day. All right. And by we, I mean me, and I think somebody else was with me. All right. We're up there, we're fishing, and I'd fish this stream a lot. It's classic high country water. All right. The fish aren't really holding in complex water. It's not a tough place to fish. I walk through and I think I've fished out all the water in front of me. So I go to move upstream. And right as I do that, this pocket that I hadn't covered all the way, this big brook trout, about 15-inch brook trout, takes off upstream, just like a bat, right? And it just shoots upstream. And my buddy looks at me and he's like, well, why didn't you catch that? I'm like, well, I didn't see it. Okay. That's why I didn't catch it, you smart aleck. So I ruined a chance at a really, really big brook trout for that water because I didn't thoroughly cover the water in front of me. So that's what I mean by covering water. All right. You need to make sure that you're fishing all the likely hiding holes for trout before you move on. Okay. If you're in a pool, like you mentioned, Ken, the first part of your question mentioned, if you're in a pool, that would mean get your flies all the way to the bottom of that pool before you move on. All right. Don't just think, okay, well, I got close to the bottom. That's good enough. No, sometimes the fish really aren't going to move. If you knock them in the nose with your nymphs, though, you got a better chance of hooking up into them. So if you're fishing a pool, all right, that means getting your flies all the way to the bottom. If you're fishing in a series of riffles and tighter pockets, make sure that you hit all of them that you can realistically reach before you move on, or else you're going to risk spooking trout like I did with that big brookie. Okay. So really good question. Again, there is no set amount of time that you need to stay in one spot before you move on. Just do your best to hit all of the likely water that holds fish. And once you feel like you've done that and nothing's going on, don't feel bad about moving on from that hole. Okay. All right. Our next question is Doug from Colorado writes, what is the correct amount to tip a guide? I've been on float trips where the guide provided lunch and others that didn't, and with the cost of gas and shuttle services, who knows what a decent tip should be. Some guides are helpful, others not so much. We were tipping $125 per person for 2 days of floating, so $250. And I guess a lot has to do with the cost of the trip. So is there a magic number? 20%. Would like to hear your thoughts. Doug, fantastic question. Thank you for writing in about this. Now, as a guide, myself, I have my own thoughts, but I'm going to save my own 2 cents for later in answering this question. All right. There's actually been quite a bit written on this subject from reputable publications like Hatch Magazine and Orvis. I'm going to link some of those articles in the podcast description today so you can read them for yourself. But where I would go ahead and start is, first off, I don't think that the example you gave here was wrong, Doug. All right. You said $125 a day per person for 2 days of floating. That is a very reasonable tip, so definitely don't beat yourself up about that. That's a very reasonable, good tip. All right, that's right about in line with what it should be. Okay. So what I like to do is I want to start out actually with this excerpt from a story that Matt Riley wrote in Hatch Magazine. Again, this one's going to be linked in the podcast description. Matt went through and he actually polled a whole bunch of guides from across the country about being tipped. What should we tip a guide? What's expected? How do guides feel about tips? So this is from folks who've been doing this guiding thing way longer than I have, folks who are really established in the industry. So again, this stuff is coming from an article that Matt Riley wrote in Hatch Magazine. And this quote that I want to share with you is from Brian Pitzer, a guide at the Northern Angler. All right. He said, and I quote, one of my most memorable tips was early on in my guide career. I took a father and son out fishing, and I could tell right away they had really been saving for the trip, and we had a spectacular time. We created some great memories for those two to share. And at the end of the day, the shop person asked if they would like to leave a gratuity for the guide service. This completely caught them off guard, and it was apparently unplanned and probably out of their budget. The guy reached into his pocket and gave me $17 for a full day trip. He shook my hand and thanked me with a most genuine smile and assured me they had a wonderful day and that this was an experience they will both remember forever. I thanked him genuinely for the gratuity and with a bit of lump in my throat. I slid his hard-earned cash into my pocket. I am pretty sure it was their gas or food money for the ride home. To this day, it still ranks as one of the most generous tips I have ever received. Generally, your tip for a fishing guide should be based upon the total experience of the trip. There are days when the fish won't stop biting and days that you work as hard as possible and catch nothing for the efforts. The amount of gratuity should be based on how the guide controls all the variables, not on the number of fish caught. I believe that most guides worth their salt would agree. As a guide, I have the privilege of sharing very special times with clients. My clients work hard to make their money, and I work hard to provide them with the best overall experience in return. A typical guide gratuity for our outfitting service is 15 to 20%. That more or less has become a standard in the industry. And that is the end of Brian Pitzer's great story that he shared in Hatch magazine. I love that story. I think that encapsulates everything that we need to remember about tipping when we go on guided trips. That really gets to it all right there. I can't say it better than Brian. All right, that was just phenomenal. So, 15 to 20% is a normal range. All right. Really, I keep going back to this story from Brian. I think it's telling that the guy who tipped him $17 that he was really, really excited. And Brian could tell like they didn't know tipping was standard. And like Brian said, it was probably their food or gas money for the drive home that they ended up tipping the guide. And yeah, you don't want to work all day and get a $17 tip, but it's not really the amount of money. I don't think is what Brian was getting at, right? It's it's more a reward for a job well done, for going above and beyond, for really busting your butt to make sure that you're giving the best experience possible. All right, there's another quote here from Orvis I'll share with you guys. They have an article about tipping guide in the guide industry. Sums it up really well. It says, quote, tipping is a way of rewarding good service, whether it's a service industry worker who performs tasks efficiently with a smile or a fishing guide who goes out of his or her way to ensure your needs are met. So I think that really kind of sums it all up right there. You should tip your guides. It's a way of rewarding really good work. Now, what about those guides who maybe aren't all that great? Okay, unfortunately, they exist, and if you get stuck with one for a day, it's hard to know what to do in the tip department. All right, the consensus that I found looking through this, and talk with other guide friends as well, is that if you have a guide who maybe just isn't the best at his job, leave like a 10% tip and then discuss your dissatisfaction with the lodge owner or the outfitter. All right, that's a better way to address it than just giving them a goose egg on the tip, because at the end of the day, they still rode you around the river all day. They still shuttle everything. They're still tying your flies on. Now, if they don't do those things, if your guy doesn't do those things, then you've got another problem on your hands. All right. But really, what it comes down to, 15 to 20% tip at minimum. And obviously more if you had just a spectacular day. All right. Remember that good guides are in the business of teaching clients and giving them a fantastic experience. If the fishing is slow for whatever reason, take into consideration what you learned, what you saw, and what you did on the trip as well. All right. All of that should go into your determination on what to tip and how much to tip. Okay. And then as for myself, I always appreciate a tip when I'm guiding. So, my 2 cents as a guide to you guys. I love it. It's not expected. And I think the general consensus is a lot of guides feel the same way. Our next question comes to us from Matt from Utah. Matt from Utah says, when should you be using fluorocarbon versus mono tippet? This is going to be a fun one, folks. Buckle up. All right. We're going to get ourselves into a little bit of a discussion here. All right. So this is a discussion that I hear a lot working with new fly anglers, mono versus fluoro, especially if they've never really fished before they move into fly fishing. It's not something that, kind of like your general outdoors person would really know. Okay. So if you don't have any clue about the mono versus fluoro argument, don't feel bad. All right. I was in that boat not too long ago when I started all this. Okay. So mono versus fluoro. We're going to define those real quick for anybody who's new to the game. All right. Monofilament, commonly called mono, tippet is the normal, doing air quotes, if you are not watching the video podcast of Untangled. All right. Monofilament, commonly called mono, is the normal kind of tippet that we all tend to use. Okay. We're all used to this stuff. This is what everybody used, however many years ago before fluoro burst onto the scene. This was the stuff. Okay. Monofilament, like its name implies, is a single strand of material. All right. It floats and it comes in a ton of different sizes to fit just about any fly fishing need. All right. Fluorocarbon tippet, on the other hand, commonly called fluoro, is still tippet. However, it is different than mono because fluorocarbon is made up of a few different kinds of materials, and these are packed really tightly together into a single strand of tippet. Fluorocarbon is usually a bit stronger than mono due to its more tightly packed molecules. Okay, because of the materials that fluoro is built from, it's also usually less visible on the water than monofilament tippet. Thanks to its density, fluorocarbon sinks quicker than monofilament as well. All right. So, recap this real quick. Fluorocarbon, monofilament, they're both fishing line. Okay. They're both tippets. They're both leaders. Okay. It's both that plastic line that we use to attach our flies to our leaders or to attach other flies to other flies. All right. Same thing. Monofilament's a single strand. It floats and it comes in a bunch of different sizes. Fluorocarbon, same thing, but it's usually a little bit stronger because of how it's built. And because of how it's built, it's usually a little bit less visible in the water. All right. Now, right out of the gates, why wouldn't you want to use something like fluorocarbon? Sounds wonderful, right? It's a little bit stronger. Who doesn't want something that's a little bit stronger, My wife's telling me all the time I need to go lift. So, yeah, everybody wants something that's a little bit stronger, right? Well, monofilament and fluorocarbon is not that cut and dried between the two of them, okay? While 5X fluoro will usually have a higher breaking strength than 5X mono, fluoro is stiffer, which makes it a little bit more brittle when knotted up, all right? So fluorocarbon knots don't have near the strength that a monofilament knot would, okay? It's not like a huge discrepancy, but it is there, okay? It is notable, all right? If you look at how most Euro nymph anglers recommend building a Euro leader, they almost all suggest that you use monofilament sections of fly line above the sider because mono knots are less prone to breaking than fluorocarbon knots. All right. So for dry fly fishing, you generally don't want your tippet or your leader to sink. So mono would be the best bet to use for dry fly fishing. Okay. The consensus is that it's best to use fluorocarbon when you're fishing nymphs, streamers, or other subsurface bugs. All right. You'll want monofilament for most other applications, including knots on heavier tippets. All right. So that's kind of your general consensus, your breakdown between mono and fluorocarbon. All right. Hopefully that answers your question there, man. Now, my own experience here is a bit mixed using mono and fluoro because I have fishing buddies who religiously fish with fluorocarbon. They won't use anything else. They won't touch mono, not even for dry fly fishing. They wouldn't touch mono if it was the only thing that would pull a giant trophy trout out of the river. All right. They would turn their nose up at it. Okay. Not quite, but they really do get pretty religious about it. My buddies that love their fluorocarbon. And I do have buddies who are the exact opposite of that too. They won't touch they won't touch fluorocarbon at all. Okay. Monofilament or bust for these guys. All right. So that kind of rubbed off on me, and I spent a lot of years fishing either with one or the other. And so I don't really have any quantifiable data to tell you, like, hey, mono is clearly better than fluorocarbon, and this is why. All right. What it boils down to for me, fluoro is a lot more expensive than mono, and I'm a cheapskate. So I usually opt for mono most of the time. Now, when I am using fluorocarbon all day on a trip, I do notice that I certainly lose a lot fewer bugs due to rocks or logs or other underwater snags. So my own experience would really tell you to recommend the conventional wisdom here, which is that fluorocarbon is great for nymphs, streamers, anything subsurface, and mono is the go-to for just about anything else that you're going to do. All right. And if you're interested in learning a little bit more about fluorocarbon and monofilament, there is an excellent post from Carl McNeil at Epic Fly Rods, which I have linked in the podcast description for you to look through. All right. So, rounding into our last question of the day, Paul from California. Paul asks, second season fly fishing and struggling with indicators. Can't seem to tell when the nymph has been hit. I've used many different types without success. All right, Paul, don't worry. Okay, the learning curve on indicators can definitely be steep at times. All right, let's dive into this, see if we can give you a hand. Okay, the rule of thumb that you're going to hear from guides, experts, writers, fly shop workers, when you ask them about this topic, is that when an indicator moves in a way that's not natural, that's when you should set the hook. Okay, if the indicator hesitates, set the hook. If it stops, set the hook. If it moves to the left or the right and it's not pulled there by the current, set the hook. All right. All that your strike indicator, and I'm going to call it a bobber, all right, because that's what it does. It bobs. So sorry if I offend anybody out there, but it's a bobber, and I'm not being derogatory towards people who fish with nymphs. I fish with nymphs often. Okay. It's a bobber. That's what it does. It bobs in the water. So I'll call it an indicator and a bobber interchangeably. All right. Anyways, all that your bobber does is show you what's happening to your leader and tippet when that leader and tippet and your flies are beneath the water's surface. Okay. So your flies, your whole rig should drift naturally with the current. Okay. If they don't, it's because they either snagged up on something or a fish ate them. Okay. Those are your two options for why they're not drifting naturally. Okay. So whenever the indicator moves in a way that's not natural, you need to set the hook. Now, if you're still having a hard time with that, if it still doesn't quite make sense, there is the possibility that you are using a bobber that's either too big or too small for your flies, and that creates problems with seeing all but like the most obvious, like slap you in the face. Yeah, that was a fish that just took my bobber. Takes. All right. For example, an indicator that's too small, it's not going to ride right on the water surface, and that creates some drag. And that drag is going to affect how natural your drift looks, and in turn, that's probably going to make that set of flies look less appetizing to trap. All right. It's hard to see a take as well if the indicator is too small. It's riding not on the water, it's kind of in the water, so it's getting pushed around a lot more. So those subtle takes are really hard to see if your indicator is too small. Okay. It's a nightmare. I've had a nymph with indicators that were too small, and unless a fish like commits and freight trains your nymphs, it's tough to see if your indicator is too small. All right. Now, if your indicator is too big, you're not going to get the feedback on some of the softer takes that you need to know to tell you when a fish took your fly. So if your indicator is too big and it's a really soft take, that indicator might not move. All right. The brief hesitations or pauses in the drift that tell you, hey, a fish just ate this, those are a lot harder to see with an indicator that's too big. All right. So that brings up the natural next question, right? How do you pick an indicator that's the right size? Gee, I'm glad you asked. Let's dive into that, okay? So the prevailing wisdom here is to use the common half-inch size. All right. If you're using something like a thingamabobber or an airlock, okay, the kind of like bubble type indicators uh that just attach to your fly line, and they're a plastic bubble and they float, and that's how you get your bobbing action. Okay. The other kinds of indicators that exist out there, like yarn or pinch on foam, they're a lot less size dependent than the plastic bobbers that we all seem to really favor these days. Uh, so go with kind of like the half-inch size for most of your trout fishing. Okay, if you're on a lake and you're fishing bigger nymphs that are a lot heavier, you're going to want a bigger indicator that holds them up better. Okay. So a good way to do this, to know if your indicator is the right size or not, is go out to the water, and if your indicator looks like it's sinking, you need a bigger one. If your indicator is just kind of drifting along and there's no movement at all on it, and you know you're deep enough, like you've checked and you know your flies are deep enough, your indicator is probably too big at that point. All right. So bottom line is this: pay attention to your indicator's drift. Right. If it varies at all from what a natural drift should look like, go ahead and set the hook. All right. And unless you're using really heavy flies, a 1/2 inch sized indicator is going to be your best bet to use in the size department. All right. So, really good set of questions this week, folks. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. And again, I'm going to put a link to where you can submit your own questions in the podcast description. So, you guys can go there, submit questions, let us know what you think. If there's anything you need to learn or that you need a refresher on or that you want to ask me as a guide and a writer, those are the kinds of questions that we would love to hear, that I would love to answer on the show. Now, I do say that I'm going to end every episode with some kind of a story, but I kind of told my story already earlier in the show about that little brook trout up in the Uinta Mountains. So I think I'm going to end, though, with one more little anecdote. It was a couple of years ago. It was my last free weekend before elk hunting season began. And a buddy of mine and I decided we were going to make a day trip into a little lake in the Wind River Mountains to chase some golden trout. All right. So it was about a 6-mile hike into the lake. So we wake up real early, hike in, fish, hike out, a 12-mile round trip. As far as Wind River trips go, it wasn't too bad because the elevation gain was only about 2,000 feet. So I say only, but for the Wind River Mountains, that's very gentle. All right. So we got up to the lake in plenty of time. We fished, caught our golden trout. Nothing big, but catching goldens is awesome. We were the only people in the whole drainage, I think, that day. There was nobody else up there. It was really nice to kind of be up there and be away from everybody. And the fishing was okay. It wasn't spectacular, but it was good. Caught some goldens. And we had lunch and then started hiking back to the truck. And I had a Mountain House meal, one of those freeze-dried meals that we all seem to like. They're super light. They're really easy to carry. So I ate my Mountain House meal and just decided to start hiking back to the truck. And I got maybe a mile into it when I started not feeling so great. And I kept on not feeling great all the way back to the truck before I ended up vomiting everything. So I hiked 5-ish miles back to the truck, feeling like I needed to throw up. It was awful. We were supposed to go fishing again the next day, and we didn't because, well, I was dying. All right. My buddy that I was with doesn't think that it was food poisoning. I do. I think I had a bad Mountain House meal. I think is what it was. I think it was expired because, I buy them and I'm not the best at always checking the dates before I go. So that's your little tip for everybody at the end of this week, a little fishing related tip. Check the expiration dates on your freeze-dried food before you go on a little adventure. Otherwise, you're going to spend 5 miles in rough country hiking back to your truck, wishing that your insides were on your outsides. And that's not a situation any of us want to be in. All right. So until next week, thank you again for listening to the show. Let us know if you've got any questions, comments, feedback at all. You can reach us at Ventures Fly Co. on social media. You can harass me on Twitter and Instagram, and I will probably respond. Get us questions if you have any other questions, and hopefully you guys can get out, get some fishing done. I know it's cold just about everywhere, but hopefully you're able to get out on the water and get into some fish anyways. So until next week, thanks a bunch. Tight lines, everybody.